This is the Expert Series podcast from the CDA Institute, Canada's premier defense and security think tank, and it's December 9th, 2025. I'm Pauline Baudu, Director of the Climate Security Programme. The CDA Institute's Climate Security Programme is launching a special series of the podcast dedicated to the 4th edition of the Montreal Climate Security Summit, which was co-hosted by the CDA Institute and the NATO Climate Change and Security Centre of Excellence. This series will highlight central takeaways from the summit. We're now diving into a dimension of climate security that often flies under the radar, but has important implications for the security of Canada as Canada moves toward its NATO commitments and navigates an increasingly contested information environment, and that is the rise of climate disinformation. We're joined by Dr. Andrew Heffernan, who has been at the forefront of this conversation. Dr. Heffernan is an adjunct professor at the University of Ottawa, specializing in international relations and comparative politics. He's also a climate associate at the Information Integrity Lab of the University of Ottawa, a rapporteur for the Forum on Information and Democracy, and a regular contributor to the Centre for International Governance Innovation. Beyond that, Andrew is deeply engaged in the scholarship of teaching and learning, and until very recently served as chair of the African Studies Association's Emerging Scholar Network. He recently wrote an opinion piece for the CDA Institute titled "Climate Disinformation is a National Security Threat. Canada and the US must confront it together." And at the Montreal Climate Security Summit, he led a workshop showcasing how climate disinformation, often amplified through digital platforms, undermines institutional trust, disrupts crisis response, and increasingly poses risks to military readiness. Andrew, we're thrilled to have you on the show.
Thank you very much. Very happy to be here, Pauline.
So before we get into disinformation actors and responses, I want to start at the foundation. You frame in your work climate disinformation as a national security threat. Why is that a strategic issue rather than simply an environmental or even just political one? And why do you think this threat remains under-recognized until today within defense and security circles?
It's a really great question. And one of the things that I actually learned in the workshop at the summit in Montreal was that it might not be under-recognized. I was really impressed and interested with how many people were coming up to me and saying that they have long realized this is the kind of issue that we should be thinking about. And increasingly, I am hearing from defense and military personnel that while we might not necessarily consider ourselves at war with Russia right now, it's partly because we are under-recognizing the disinformation and the hybrid war aspect of this kind of thing, right? So obviously, I mean, you can sort of have a debate about the degree to which we as the West are contributing to and partly at war in the hot war in Ukraine that is going on with Russia right now. But Russia is attacking us consistently. They are meddling in democracies across the West and certainly Canada's. They are meddling with our information. They are propagating specifically climate disinformation in order to continue to sow divide within our societies and to continue to see the world rely on fossil fuels, which they have a big part in. So in a sense, it is increasingly recognized within security and defense circles that this is a real issue, but it might also almost be part of the broader public and maybe even the government that are not effectively realizing that this is really something that is central and maybe the kind of conflict or even war that we're already a part of. And that's why I do think that the climate disinformation aspect very specifically, but more broadly, questions of information integrity are really strategic issues as opposed to, as the question mentions, more of an environmental or a political one. But information integrity is at the heart of our strategic interests. And, as I said, a lot of people will argue that we are already at war in this regard. And while this war remains a bit of a cold one to this point, It is really fanning the flames of polarization domestically within our economies, which is undermining our ability to act effectively within our democracies and to deal with issues like climate change or others. So increasingly understanding this as a strategic issue is vital in order to understand when we might already be at war.
Thanks. And I was reading through the notes of the workshop, and you're mentioning the fact that it's a feedback loop. There's a feedback loop where instability fuels misinformation and misinformation deepens instability. Would you like to comment further on this?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, as soon as there is any kind of polarization, instability, distrust in government, distrust in expertise, all of which we have been seeing, it's been a slow increasing pattern for quite some time. These patterns tend to replicate themselves, especially in the algorithmic social media landscape that we know. But these also begin to form toeholds where our enemies, and Russia is a very obvious example, but there are many others, can work in through climate disinformation and other forms or other attacks on information integrity to be able to work at and tear away those little footholds that begin as a little bit of polarization, a little bit of disagreement, more and more polarized debates on more and more issues. And we've been seeing these kinds of things happening for years, probably decades. Obviously, the pandemic was a real turning point, I think, for this, where there was more and more polarization within society. And this is partly what led to that, or has contributed to those feedback loops, where more and more we are seeing ourselves as being within certain camps and seeing the other side of people within our own territory. And this is something that the real other side, because while we might see people kind of on the right and left domestically within Canada, obviously we have real adversaries elsewhere. And as we become more adversarial domestically, our outside adversaries can really play on those kinds of those kinds of issues, that kind of tension domestically, that really leads to this feedback loop where tension and polarization begets tension, and people start to believe that there is this polarization. People believe there are these camps, and they start to identify more and more within these camps, and they start to, again, identify more against their domestic adversaries as opposed to the real ones that we all share externally.
And it's also clear, both in your work and in your responses, that that climate disinformation isn't organic, it's purposeful. So I wonder if you could, first for our listeners, maybe explain the difference between climate disinformation and misinformation. I remember hearing you say during a conference recently this year that any climate misinformation should be considered disinformation. Could you elaborate on this?
Yeah, absolutely. So the sort of dictionary differences between misinformation and disinformation is the intent aspect, with disinformation having intent to deceive, and misinformation being information that might be similarly incorrect to disinformation, but that might be kind of shared or spread a bit unknowingly or unwittingly. The example I often give is if your grandmother or your uncle shares something on their Facebook or Twitter feeds, they might not know or might not be purposefully deceiving people, but they are contributing to this spread of misinformation, as opposed to disinformation, which is when somebody, again, is deliberately trying to deceive the public. Why I think that we should consider most forms of misinformation, and particularly climate change misinformation, as disinformation is because of the targeted, well-funded, and coordinated nature of disinformation. So while it might eventually get to our unsuspecting grandmothers or our slightly crazy uncle who, shares this kind of thing because they happen to think it's real and they're not intending to deceive, it is a well-funded and targeted campaign that is creating these lines of disinformation to begin with. And what that looks like is fossil fuel companies, bad actors across different countries, Russia, China, non-state actors as well, who all have shared interests in either perpetuating and continuing the burning of fossil fuels and therefore pushing back against effective climate policies, or, as we've alluded to already a little bit, simply sowing divide within society there are all these seemingly disparate and distinct actors who are not necessarily like, having meetings on this stuff and deciding how they will go about coordinating their attacks, but using the same types of language through the same types of social media tools and through working with these social media tools to harvest our information and know who will be susceptible to their disinformation, who will then spread it as misinformation. So again, by the time it gets to the person who is kind of unwittingly sharing it as misinformation, it is partly because that person was directly targeted through very well-funded and coordinated campaigns through what is clearly disinformation. And as a result, if we understand these kinds of things as not necessarily being unwittingly shared, but as a result of companies that have billions and billions of dollars at stake in getting to the person unwittingly spreading that misinformation, it's much more important, I think, if we understand not only that it is disinformation specifically, and that it is a clear disinformation economy that is working against the benefit of the public.
And also during the workshop, the speaker presentations highlighted the role of both state and non-state actors. And we do talk about Russia. There are other states, we can think of other states which are at worst seeding, at best amplifying climate disinformation. What I wonder is, what do these actors gain by undermining public trust in climate science? And how coordinated are these efforts in practice? What's the link, so to speak, between fossil fuel industries, some states, and then fabricated thinking at the more local level? We talk about some think tank foundations. So how's the ecosystem looking?
Yeah, so especially as it relates to climate disinformation, and there's a lot of different types of disinformation and attacks on information integrity, but much of climate disinformation has really stemmed from the fossil fuel industry. And at its basic form, this really began with climate denialism, suggesting that climate change is either not real or not human-induced, or increasingly that it might be real, but we just can't really do anything about it because of these large processes. And with that, the clear interest is, again, to have us continue to buy and burn fossil fuels. One of the things that's become interesting is, unsurprisingly, these very well-funded, coordinated, and targeted campaigns are also pretty intelligent. So as the science has become increasingly irrefutable, and as more and more people have begun to believe in the science of climate change, and outright climate denial has become less productive to propagate, climate disinformation has evolved as well. So increasingly, they are not necessarily just suggesting that climate change is fake, but through algorithms, through AI, and through the harvesting of our data and the selling of it to third and fourth parties, increasingly they know which one of us might be susceptible to which types of climate disinformation. Some people might be susceptible to the full denialism. Others might be susceptible to believing that EVs cause more environmental harm than benefit. Others might be more susceptible to thinking that, the carbon tax might be effective, but that it costs people a lot of money, or that it costs people a lot of money and that it's not effective at all, or that Canada, for example, is such a low percentage of greenhouse gas emissions that us curbing our greenhouse gas emissions isn't going to do anything to deal effectively with climate change. So increasingly, they've evolved their tactics to decide how to target people differently through climate disinformation, which is sort of the preliminary goals. And then beyond that, as I've alluded to already, there are a number of actors who are not necessarily, but might be interested in the continuation of burning of fossil fuels. But a lot of those same actors tend to be interested in simply sowing divide within society. And while climate change is clearly a real global crisis, it also happens to be one of the most polarizing over time. We've seen a lot of other issues over vaccines and COVID and masking and extreme weather events, elections, all of these kinds of areas that we see challenges to information integrity. But climate change is kind of one of the crises that have been here for decades and will be here for decades. And as a result, it's sort of the most open avenue or inroads to sow polarization and divide. So a lot of actors that aren't necessarily interested in climate change or fossil fuels at all see climate disinformation as a particular inroads just to sow divide within society itself. And this is the kind of divide that takes down empires from within, right? And I don't want to overstate this, but Rome was kind of brought down from within, and we're seeing the same types of things in the U.S. Clearly, there is no adversary that can rival U.S. military power, but the U.S. seems to be pretty, doing a pretty good job of taking itself apart from within, and that's part of what they're interested in. Which all leads to the question of coordination. And this is a really difficult question, right? There are a lot of different kinds of actors, fossil fuel companies, some of which are Canadian, some of which are American, some of which are Russian, who, as I mentioned earlier, are not having meetings about how they can sow divide within Canada or other countries. But they do share these targeted purposes, and so much disinformation and the attacks that we're seeing on information integrity are really happening within the social media landscape, that so many of these sort of disparate seeming interests are increasingly overlapping to the point where their attacks really become coordinated. We see fossil fuel interests aligning with the interests of our enemies that are more concerned about geopolitical wins, which very often, unfortunately, align with the interests of social media companies and tech billionaires who make money off this kind of disinformation, right? We know that if it bleeds, it leads, and fantastic, crazy-sounding headlines are those that we linger on longer, that we click on more often. And this is how we're seeing these very disparate-seeming interests align in a lot of ways, and therefore become coordinated in a sense. So it's a more loose type of coordination than we might otherwise think. But it's because of these different types of interests becoming aligned, and especially with the monetization of disinformation and that disinformation economy functioning like it is, this is really where we see the coordination come in.
And really understand this rationale and this ecosystem behind really helps clarify the stakes. So for our listeners now who mostly work with issues related to Canadian defense and security, the question is also, so what for their work? So you mentioned that disinformation can directly undermine military readiness and crisis response, including by weakening democratic resiliency, but it goes beyond that. So can you walk us through a concrete example of how, in your view, a climate-related disinformation campaign could disrupt Canada's or NATO's ability to respond to security threats?
Absolutely. So, so often I think that we think of the military and defense organizations as something distinct or separate from the government or from society, something that is out there. And I would say that this is not the case, right? We are all very much intertwined, and effective military readiness and defense capabilities relies on trust with local people and populations and effective communication between them. Especially as it relates to climate change, we often think of this as one of those crises that are out there, and it is certainly impacting a lot of countries in the global south a lot more. But clearly, Canada is not immune, as we are seeing more and more extreme weather events, more and more historic wildfires every year, more extreme weather events in the winter as well. And I would say, unfortunately, very often it falls on the military to respond to this. And this is the same kind of thing for our NATO allies across much of the Western world, where more and more the military is being called upon to respond to these extreme weather events. And if there isn't that level of trust with the population, not only can this lead to loss of lives of the public, if they don't know where and when and how the military itself is calling for responses, telling people where to go, using effective lines of communication. And these are the things that we've seen already. We've seen disinformation spread during emergencies. Hurricane Helene in the U.S. was an example of this last year, where people were saying that the Biden administration were only offering help to certain people, or were telling people to go certain places when those places weren't actually safe. And this was leading to increased loss of lives in the short term. Also, the military is there during these extreme weather events to protect people, and it can't effectively do its job if it can't effectively communicate with people, or if there is not that line of trust. And so often disinformation, again, is about sowing divide and breaking those lines of trust. Additionally, we've seen this kind of emergency information being spread and shared on social media, often for beneficial purposes. But as the Canadian government has increasingly tried to regulate these online tech platforms, Meta and Google were examples of this over the past few years. These sites have actually pulled effective, accurate news that was needed by some people who only had access to this through those feeds, right? So this is another way that we can see the broader conversations around disinformation and how accurate information or inaccurate information can be spread on social media platforms, and the bridges of trust and trust or lack thereof that can lead to divides within society that can really undermine military readiness, its ability to engage, its ability to protect people, and again, the trust that people have in it, especially knowing that militaries aren't always trusted globally.
Yeah, and that's fascinating. So building on this, where do you see the biggest gaps in current institutional responses, both globally and in Canada, more specifically?
Yeah, so again, this is something that I heard a fair bit at the summit, and that has been part of conversations more and more. We can easily point to threats like Russia, as we've mentioned, other states and many non-state actors. But one of the biggest gaps might not be, or might currently be, the degree to which we are treating Russia as a threat. Again, are we in conflict with Russia right now with the way we are assisting Ukraine? That is one question that's up for debate. But if we really understood the degree to which Russia is consistently attacking us and that we are consistently being damaged in a number of ways, this might be one of the biggest gaps, right? If we are not realizing who our enemies are, if we are not seeing them, if we are all unknowingly continuing to scroll on these apps, to click, to engage in disinformation, to have our own data and information harvested and sold to third and fourth party organizations, we are perhaps unwittingly engaging in a form of hybrid warfare that we're not really fighting. And these can be some of the significant kinds of gaps. And one of the things that makes me a little bit optimistic is with the increased realization that the world is an increasingly dangerous place, there is more and more funding going towards defense departments across the world, which is a good start. But if all of that goes to planes, submarines, tanks, and we're not thinking about the increasingly hybrid nature of warfare, and again, questioning to what degree we are under attack or at war with actors like Russia at this moment, might be a significant gap that if we keep trying to fight the wars of the past, which is so often the case, we might be doomed to failure.
I'm curious if, from a national security perspective, specifically, if you could think of one or two top priorities, what the Defense Department or the Canadian Armed Forces role should be. How do you see it in countering disinformation?
I do think that is the probably multi-billion-dollar question, and I'm not sure anybody has a great answer for it yet. I think that at this moment, I wish I had more of a clear answer to give. I think at this moment, as we are still trying to wrap our hands around this potential hybrid type of warfare that we might already be playing, and probably playing asymmetrically and probably losing, I think it's going to start by requiring a lot more research on this kind of topic, right? Trying to figure out to what degree we are being attacked, how and in what ways are these strategic concerns, which are the kinds of conversations you and I are having here. How is this damaging Canada's military readiness? How is this undermining Canada's security or sovereignty in the Arctic or maybe elsewhere? Thinking about these key conversations that we are increasingly having as a society, that is a good starting point. But realizing that we are not effectively or sufficiently talking about the importance of information integrity and the ability to have conversations, right? If we think that we are going to be able to deal with all of these information, with all of these issues by increasingly building our traditional military capacities, we again really might be missing the wars of the future that we are actually potentially already engaged in. So thinking about that kind of strategic place and how we need to start thinking much more ahead. And again, I think that means that there's going to be a lot of open question marks. And I think it starts by approaching these with humility. I think actors like D&D and CAF have to realize that they need to accept that they might not know what's best or where priorities need to go next, where resources need to go. But realizing that there are these known unknowns and then trying to figure those out from there, right? If we keep trying to tackle the same old types of issues, or if we keep waiting for the same old type of war to come to us or the same old attacks on our sovereignty to come to us, I think we may well be too late. And I think this is partly the exercise in realizing that our sovereignty is probably already being undermined in a number of ways. And it starts by really accepting that, understanding the place of cybersecurity and information integrity in all of that, and realizing that that might be just as important as protecting the sovereignty in our Arctic as well.
I guess also to help answer this multi-million-dollar question, it's also maybe what can help is looking at what's being done elsewhere. I know that during the summit, you mentioned that building societal resiliency is such a key pillar of countering climate disinformation and the associated security risks. And during the workshop, you referenced Estonia and Finland as examples of good practices for cross-sector efforts to strengthen this resiliency. I wonder what lessons can Canada learn from these countries' whole of society approaches to countering climate disinformation?
It's a really great question. And why I think this is a really great question is, as I've mentioned already, I don't think that we can see the military as separate from the government, as separate from the people, as separate from private industry, which is why I've talked a lot about these whole of society approaches. And part of the problems I think that we've been seeing in Canada is that we've rested a bit too much on kind of the democratic dividend and the safety that we feel by being surrounded sort of by oceans and the U.S., who has traditionally at least been a good partner in our security. But increasingly, Canadians are realizing that the world might not be as safe as we have thought it has been for the past 20 or 30 years. And this is what's required, is bringing people on board more and more. What we can learn from Estonia and Finland is how to develop this whole of society approach. And its people are very aware of the threat that Russia and other organizations and states pose because they are on the front lines of this defense. And that's part of what goes into this, right? I mean, it's a question of, does the government lead? Is it up to academics to lead? Is it up to the military to lead? As opposed to that, it's really a whole of society approach that is required to bring society on board, to bring the public on board, so that we vote for these kinds of things, so that government has the political willpower to put our GDP power behind these kinds of initiatives. Because the military can't do it alone, and increased military spending or foreign policy has never been something that Canadians have really been particularly interested in or voted on. But by realizing that these kinds of issues are real, by realizing the hybrid threats that we are already experiencing, and the real kinetic threats that Ukraine is obviously experiencing, but that are very close to Estonia and Finland, this is how they get buy-in and how they are able to have much more military and civilian readiness for these kinds of things, and have ongoing buy-in from people for their governments to make sure that they are well-financed and ready for all of these kinds of eventualities that might not be as far off as we've always hoped they were.
That's so helpful to understand. And I feel like because it connects, information integrity connects to so many aspects of life and society, it can feel overwhelming at times. But you do end the op-ed you published with an optimistic note by saying that the good news is that Canada is well positioned to lead in this space. And I remember that the workshop also ends with a positive note saying that there's a reason why there's so much efforts and money put into climate disinformation, because it wouldn't be the case if climate action was not as threatening. What gives you hope that Canada is equipped for this information battle, and what's at stake ultimately?
I will preface my optimism by suggesting that these are dark and concerning times. We are facing no shortage of overlapping crises, and it is unnerving at this point. One of the, again, kind of scary things about disinformation is that it sows divide. It undermines our very ability to govern other issues, which is the challenge. Another problematic part is that I think we're a little bit late coming to this table, which is partly why we are a little bit behind our enemies and behind these disinformation actors that have so much built into their economies so that they fund them so well. But this is partly what's optimistic as well. I think that we got off to a slow start and we are starting from a step behind, but that means that we have a lot of room to catch up as well. Canada particularly, I think, is well positioned because we have historically not really been a part of the types of geopolitical, at least the major power geopolitical struggles that have happened. If we are seeing a slow demise or at least clear challenges to the US-led liberal international order, whether we are going into some kind of bipolar order or multipolar order, Canada has generally been seen as I think, a good actor, as a middle power. I think people tend not to fear us or thinking that we are going to be expanding our geopolitical capabilities, trying to take over other states, trying to, accomplish these kinds of goals on other people's territory. We share more like-minded actors than not, while we are in this particular moment where there does seem to be a lot of adversaries that have been sort of traditional enemies or traditional adversaries, plus some of our traditional best friends who are increasingly adversarial. I would like to think that it is a moment in time and that these moments can pass, and that as we continue to act as Canadians that are interested in dealing with these domestic issues, but that are quintessentially global issues and working through our multilateral approaches as we have traditionally done and contributed to effectively, I think there is a lot of ability to do so. And so much of this comes down to public will. As I've mentioned, the defense sector is not separate from the government and not separate from the people, and all of these people have to work together. And while for the past 20 or 30 years, Canadians have kind of rested on our laurels and have not been thinking about foreign policy and have not been thinking that much about investing in and expanding our military capabilities. In the past, when Canada has been called on to do so, it has, and it has always met the moment and come to the table. And as we are increasingly being called upon now, I think we have very quickly, in a very short period of time, come back to the table. And not only are we coming to the table on military and defense, we are looking at how we can regulate some of these tech and online platforms. We are still engaged in climate conversations and thinking about how we can do these kinds of things. We have just at COP signed on to the Global Initiative on Information Integrity and Climate Change. Canada is doing something, and Canada will remain here. And Canadians, as we continue to realize that there are these growing global challenges, will always, I think, have the willpower to call on our government to develop the local capacities that we need for dealing with these challenges, as I've mentioned, domestically, but also globally, so that we can effectively regulate and take care of these issues as well.
Andrew, thank you for bringing such clarity to an issue that is often misunderstood, but as it's very clear after talking with you, is increasingly central to national security. It was great to have you on the show today.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure being here, and I really appreciate you putting this work together.
And that is all for today's episode. Thank you for joining us on this special series. If you want to learn more about the CDA Institute, the Climate Security Programme, or the Montreal Climate Security Summit, follow us on social media, visit our website at cdainstitute.ca, or subscribe to our newsletter for the latest updates on Canadian defence and international security. If you have comments or feedback about what you heard in today's edition, please email me at pauline@cdainstitute.ca. I'm Pauline Baudu. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll be back before you know it.